Morning, all.
Morning.
Welcome back after a little break, having last week off. I know that materials were circulated and input was provided back to the RTA team, so appreciative of that. Let's go ahead and kick off this meeting with call to order and move right into item number 2 on the agenda. RTA financial health indicators analysis and reporting. So Dan, it looks like that's the bulk of our meeting today, and I will turn it over to you and the team to lead the committee through.
And I'm going to turn this right over to Mr. Jamie Brown and his team to walk us through this item.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity to revisit this item. We just introduced it a few weeks ago, very briefly, to let you know that we were thinking about the financial health indicators and the financial performance measures, and we're going to bring some information to you, and we want to start that conversation today. So today we're going to talk about 3 different areas of the financial performance measures. And on screen, you should see a summary sheet that was shared just yesterday that shows 5 performance measures, financial performance measures, 3 of which focus really on inflation adjustments for revenues and for project costs. And so the bulk of the conversation will be discussion of concepts about how we recommend approaching that. Following that, there'll be a discussion about tracking industry cost trends. And then wrapping up the conversation will be an introduction to how cash flow will be tracked and reported on a regular basis during the life of RTA Next. And so just again, to remind everybody why this is important, this has come up in conversation with the TMC as well as the subcommittee about the importance of tracking financial performance measures throughout the duration of the plan. But it's also incorporated into the POPs. There are requirements for the financial review process. We want to make sure that we're responsive to those requirements in the POPs. And we demonstrate to this subcommittee how we intend to follow through on those requirements in the POPs. And the end of the goal of this is to really gain your confidence in how this is going to be tracked over time. And then finally, I think an important consideration is that the new plan, the RTA Next plan, there's more consequence to the tracking of revenues and costs as it relates to commitments in the plan for the revenue above the pessimistic forecast. As we know that the 75% of those would be directed to the city of Tucson until 55% of the target is reached. So it's really important that we have a common understanding about how that's going to be tracked and reported. And so with that, again, we're going to have about 2.5 hours today to talk about this. We want to leave a little bit of time in the middle of the 3-hour block to have a brief break so everybody can stretch. And then I think Dan's going to wrap up the conversation too with what's on the agenda for next week. So to kick us off, we'll have Adam talk about inflation adjustments for revenues and costs. Thank you.
Jamie and Adam, let me just check with the committee members, see if anybody has a question based on your overview before we start diving into the details. Any questions or comments from committee members? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so Adam, go right ahead, please. I think the team is on mute, it looks like. So Jamie, Adam, we can't hear you. It looks like your mic is muted. Okay, I'm not able to hear anything.
Check.
it's disabled for this, I think. Check, check. Can you hear me? Test.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties there. So the first document we'll be looking at today is it's the Planned Health Indicators Terminology and Frequently Asked Questions. I thought that in phrasing the questions that I anticipated this subcommittee might have, that would be a good way to run through it. Really today, hopefully we can focus on more of the theory behind what we want to do, what you all want to do, and move into more hard numbers with examples next week. The reasoning for that will become clear as we kind of work through some of these. So my goal is to run us through all the concepts using these frequently asked questions, see how close we are to a consensus, and then we'll pop everything into a comment resolution matrix, that same Excel format where we had the A, B, or C as far as how close we were to consensus, and we'll bring that back next week with any additional materials or explanations that you'd like to see. So just very briefly before we get into it, I wanted to go through, we'll take everybody back to Finance and Econ 101 just to refresh some basic concepts as far as interest moving through time. So really just the main thing is just talking about the way that an index functions as far as interest is related. So if we experience 2% interest in any given year, $100 affected by that 2% would then be $102. Easy stuff. That following year, when the additional, let's say that interest rate stays kind of flat and it's 2% again. So that following year, that $102 wouldn't just turn into $104, it turned into $104.04. If we kept going, the next year it'd be $106.12. By around, year 6 or so, we'd see like $117 versus $116. So there's always a slight little rise every year, even though the inflation year over year looks the same. At the end of the day, I use that $100 because the effects of that inflation on $100 allow us to use a very easy kind of index to multiply either back or forth across time from a base year to any year that's experienced any number of those years worth of inflation. And that's what an index is. The two most common are the Consumer Price Index and the GDP Price Deflator. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, but the thing that I wanted to just remind everybody is that in general, the CPI and the GDP price deflator run very, very closely together over time. They've always tracked pretty well. The GDP is a little different. They're not one-to-one, but they do follow pretty closely. So having that said, any questions about that? I know this is kind of basic stuff, but just, any index that represents inflation is just a multiplier between a base year and whatever year you're looking at. As long as everybody's feeling good on that, we'll go ahead and move on. All right. So what financial measures are we tracking and why? This is the most obvious level stuff. We're calculating revenues versus projections because that's how we're determining what potential additional revenue is. Potential additional revenue just happens to work out to be PAR, P-A-R. So to save a lot of syllables, I'll just refer to those as PAR or PAR funds as we go through this conversation. We need to, the reason I talked about inflation is because we need to talk about cost and what inflation is going to do to costs over time. We always have the assumption built into any plan like this that $2.67 billion of revenue is going to actually scale up as we see real world inflation affecting prices every year for a sales tax. And so too, we should see costs rise due to inflation. And our hope is that they scale pretty closely together. We've seen some instances where they don't scale closely together, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Par distribution versus available cash on hand. Not going to try to get too deep into this because this is very much scenario driven. And when we're playing with monopoly money at the beginning and I can change every piece of inflation, I can change every revenue dollar. There's so many variables that it's hard to work through any model that has any kind of teeth moving forward more than a couple of years or 3. But in concept, it'll be good to kind of talk about and understand where the board might be thinking about making decisions in the future. So just as far as financial measures at a high clip, any questions on that so far? And this is just the what. We're clearly we're not into the how yet.
Are you on the Q&A?
Oh, yeah, and yeah, if we can go ahead and bring up the frequently asked questions, that second half of that document. Yeah, perfect. And I just did a little glossary of terms in case anybody has any questions. Paul, I see a hand up.
Yeah, so just a real quick question. We're in Oro Valley, we're going through some taxes and some changes ourselves. And what we're finding on the municipal level anyways, that there are some extra hoops that I did not know existed that I'm starting to learn more about taxes than I ever wanted to know in my life as an engineer. And a lot of it has to do with dealing with ADOR. As PAG and RTA they're not municipalities. They're a different breed altogether. Will the tax of RTA 1 seamlessly end and the tax of RTA next, should it pass, seamlessly start so that you have that contiguous cash flow and there won't be some glitch, some ADOR thing that we have to deal with on the front end? I guess that would be my only concern moving forward is again on that cash flow that if we end RTA 1 early, March 31st, and we are planning on starting RTA next, April 1st, there isn't any impediments to that from a state legislature standpoint.
Colleague Jim DeGroot on this.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Kiesler, we have been in touch with ADOR. They have a copy of our ballot language. The ballot language, as it's been written, calls for the early termination of the RTA tax at the midnight of March 31st, with the imposition of the new tax on April 1st. So we've not heard of any concerns at this point from ADOR. That again, they're still looking at the ballot language, but and I know that our attorney is also in conversations with them.
Okay, okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chair, seeing no other questions, we'll go ahead and just move right into it. So right off the bat, how do we adjust for inflation? PAC's recommendation is to use the GDP price deflator for a number of reasons. One is, I think we all instinctively, well, at least the economists here, we're gravitating towards CPI. But I guess the nice thing about the GDP price deflator is that, first of all, it's mentioned in statute, and it's the evaluation tool for the substantial change clause. And if prices or if costs exceed a certain threshold, as far as like reporting that on an annual basis, the GDP is what they're looking for. The GDP is also the tool by which we evaluate and inflate the MOE as it relates to transit expenses for Pima County, Marana, Tucson, South Tucson. So we've got some history with that index. It's almost a situation where we feel like let's make it simple for everybody. Let's use the one reference number. As long as we're on a level playing field there, it seems to make sense. We have some suggestions as far as modifiers when we're looking at project costs, but in general, to understand what revenue is doing over time and what costs are doing over time, we'd like to land on the GDP price deflator versus CPI or any other index that's floating out there. Paul.
Yeah, so is there a way, because I think what we experienced over the past 6 years is a construction inflation that did not match standard inflation. So it didn't follow, parallel to the CPI, or I'm no economist. Maybe I'm using the wrong term here. Anyways, we don't use a lot of different things in this world. We use concrete, we use asphalt, we use, certain piping materials, we use wire, poles, signals, things like that. Would it be advantageous to take a handful of those major things that we utilize and track that pricing? Because, Cal Portland going down will have a direct impact to our cost that wouldn't be realized with some, national level. Yet that impact is real nonetheless. So I was thinking that, I've been thinking long and hard about this one. Should we just put together those materials that we usually use and track that pricing as our indicator?
That's a great question, and that's something that we are absolutely advocates for. There's two pillars of evaluation, right? First, we need to do what we agree as an organization. What the RTA board eventually decides is, what do we need to track through time, cost-wise, that RTA is automatically responsible for? So should we just use the amount of increase in revenues every year as a percentage and just adjust costs to that so that we're on that level playing field? Should we use the GDP deflator, for example? Once we get past GDP deflator, the real question becomes, we're going to see potentially prices increase above that. In other scenarios, we've talked about this kind of escalation protocol and what happens if costs come in higher than we anticipated. Well, we need to use something to set what we think is the ceiling of anticipation for what we're supposed to just cover automatically. And so I think what we'd experience in a real world is, if we have a $10 million project that's 10 years out and the GDP price deflator dictates that that should be a $13 million project by the time we get to it. Well, that's what the GDP price deflator said. Let's say a cost estimate comes in now at 14 million.
Yeah.
We need to assess what is happening above that ceiling through some sort of process. We have a pretty good one outlined. I think we had some really great conversation and a general consensus on that. But the question theoretically for today's group is, that 13 million that I talked about GDP deflator getting us to, is that the ceiling? Is that the automatic where we say, yeah, we all expected that to happen? That's a standard number that's built into the statute and everywhere else. So 13 million, we bake that in, revenues are rising, we bake that in. But that difference between 13 and 14, that 1 million, that's where we kick in that conversation. That's where we have that escalation protocol. That's really our recommendation. So I'm skirting around your question in a second, because Pari, my colleague, has done some really excellent research and is going to show you all kind of what kind of green flag, yellow flag, red flag indicators we're going to use related to construction costs and the way that they're trending differently from any of the standard inflation indices. But in theory, just to back up to that, do we like that concept? Is it worth having some additional discussion right now about something like the GDP price deflator setting a ceiling, and then we all just kind of know that any costs that come in above that, when those estimates come in and we're really ready to roll, that kicking in the escalation protocol, committees discuss it, RTA board makes the final call on whether the jurisdiction or whether the RTA as a whole is going to be responsible for those additional funds?
Yeah.
Adam, let's pause there. That's a great question. I mean, let's pause there, right, and see if there's any reaction from the committee. And Paul, it sounded like you were going to offer a comment. Go ahead, and then I'd like to hear from anyone else on that suggestion that Adam just made from an overall conceptual perspective.
Yeah, I was having a hard time at the beginning of this conversation seeing how this ties to policy. Now I completely understand how this ties to policy, because we need to have that set. I think this is a good approach. You need to have some type of baseline that everybody can understand, but some type of a arbitrator when things don't go as expected. And, is this due to scope creep from a jurisdiction, or is this purely everybody is a victim here due to an escalation that is over and above? And how do you split that baby in creating that policy? So I really do like this conversation and where you guys are going on this so far.
Thanks, Paul. And Andy.
Thanks. I agree with everything on a conceptual level. I'm just curious to Paul's point. I think it's a good one about more local indices. Was there any consideration of ADOT's construction cost index in your thinking? And if so, where did you land on that GDP rather than ADOT CCI?
Thanks, Andy, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. I think, again, we're in two pillars, and one's the policy driven and what needs to be the minimum standard for setting a ceiling. And then there's what does reality look like? The CCI has kind of gone wild in the last few years, as we all know. It's taken a slight dip. That's nice, but the pattern on that usually looks like it takes a little dip and then it continues to springboard higher. What we're proposing is that we establish the statutory limit or the policy-driven limit, and then we can also provide regular analysis and monitoring using more construction cost-oriented indices. There are actually a few that are pretty nice. CCI is certainly a good one because it is locally produced at ADOT. But that's really more of a consideration for where does the potential additional revenue, the PAR funds, need to be distributed, right? Like, I'm kind of jumping the gun. I'm getting into another topic here, but let's say we've got extra revenues. They're sitting out there, and we say, well, where do we want to put them? And we see that the construction costs are far outpacing inflation. It would stand to reason that applying those to roadway project costs would be a smart thing, but ultimately, we feel like that's in a battery of recommendations that we would make, and we would provide thoughtful analysis and reporting so that the committees and that the board can ultimately make that decision. So yeah, all the construction indices are higher. So the first question is the policy-driven one is, what's the ceiling? Is there any appetite for going higher than what the GDP allows for? Because the GDP price deflator is the one that triggers substantial change in the things in statute. That's why we're kind of recommending that one, is because we have some code that can point to that and at least allow us a baseline that's relatively unbiased. Because if we go to CCI, what if somebody else wants a national construction cost index? Suddenly we're getting into a conversation where we're introducing kind of bias and where we want that responsibility threshold to be. When we think that it would be better to just kind of leave it as with the one metric that already is tied to MOE. Because we don't debate about MOE, right? We say the GDP deflator is what it is, and that's where the costs rise. And there you go. And we've been doing that for 19 years. I would suggest a similar approach as far as evaluating costs that are automatically assumed to be covered by the RTA board. And I'll pause again there because I know that's a lot.
And
Good answer. Makes sense to me. Sorry.
Go ahead. I appreciate that. I just think, to sum up, I think what I heard said is that, we would set potentially, right, if that's the decision of this committee, the GDP is the system of measure, so to speak, but it wouldn't preclude us from bringing information from those other sources forward for more granular analysis of what options we may want to consider. And so that's what I think I heard. I saw a nod from the team. Andy, I'm sorry to cut you off. Sounded like you had a follow-up.
No, my apologies. I was just saying good answer, Adam. That made a lot of sense to me, and I agree with the approach.
Okay, super.
Carmine, I'm so sorry. If I could just jump in for a second. Issa, if you wouldn't mind, there's a chart that shows a comparison between construction costs and where revenues have been coming in. I just want to let you know that now so we can pull it up while we're still having a conversation.
It's the construction cost trend index.
Construction cost trend index. There we go. I just want to splash a graphic on screen, and I don't want to steal Pari's thunder here, so we potentially could pivot and have Pari just kind of introduce what we were thinking about as far as recommending stuff. Also, I recognize that I just stepped all over the turn order here, Catherine. I apologize.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment. I mean, I agree that MOE has been adjusted by GDP. I just wanted to note, I mean, that is for a very different type of cost. I mean, that's labor related and operations of a transit system, which is very different than the construction cost indicators. So I think I'm looking forward to hearing how this, we do need to set thresholds and when we're worried about things, there is a big difference between construction costs and operating a transit system in my mind. So we need to be mindful of that because the GDP would not have been adequate for some of the construction cost increases we've seen in recent years.
Thanks, Catherine.
I might turn it over to Pari for just a second to just walk us through one example of what our analysis and what we would be bringing to the committees on a regular basis might look like.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. The graphic you're seeing here on the screen is the comparison of the National Highway Construction Cost Index with the GDP deflator. So those are the solid line, the blue and the green line there. So start off with the National Highway Construction Cost Index. It's an index that tracks the actual bid price of the highway construction project funded by FHWA nationwide. So this is the index that the FHWA produce on a quarterly basis. This is going to be the most relevant index because it shows the changes in price of the highway construction and maintenance nationwide. For example, an upward trend in the NHCCI would suggest that the highway construction costs have risen, which when the trend emerges, we should be prepared to see higher construction costs for the project. That's about to go out for bid. And the idea of this is to act as an early warning sign of what the industry is doing. Arizona ADOT has its own CCI as well. I'm bringing this NHCCI up just to give a clearer picture of it compared to the national level of GDP deflator. But I can tell you that the state CCI trends very closely and it pretty much follows the trend of the national level. And you will notice that it rose pretty significantly from GDP for the last, I would say, like 4 or 5 years. But the recent NHCCI might not be the best, and it's not a recommendation for adjusting the cost right away, but rather just an information and decision support tool is because it's very volatile. Notice in the year 2024, the jump was very significant from quarter 2 to quarter 3. So if we use NHCCI to evaluate this every quarter, we might run into the scenario where we might be overcorrecting for inflation. I'll pause there for any questions.
Any questions from committee members? Paul, you're on mute.
I'm still a proponent of a tie to local cost trends because again, they're so volatile. A plant going down, either in Phoenix or Tucson, has direct impact for us. The supply and demand. You know, bringing our concrete in from California, that's huge spikes, and having some local handle on that. And I don't know if the ADOT from a state standpoint gets to that fairness. Because again, at the end of the day, I think what we're all looking to do here is to create a fairness for each of the agencies as, you know, unfortunately, contract bids come in higher. Why are they coming in higher? Again, is it due to scope creep? Or is it truly due to just a cost increase that's out of everybody's control?
Thanks, Paul. Can somebody clarify on the left of the chart, what's the unit of measurement that's shown there on the scale for the on the far left?
Rescale to 2020 Q1 equals 1. So what it means is all the things that we tracked, if in Q1 of 2020 it cost $1, how much would it cost in the subsequent year? So that's it's not measured in dollars, but rather in comparison to the year 2020.
Okay. So it's a 2020 baseline, and then it's a measure of change from that baseline. If it costs $1, then going all the way out to Q1 of 2025, if we're looking at the CCI, it would be $1.60. I'm trying to assess, right, how big is the gap between the two indices. So if we look at the GDP deflator in 2025 Q1 and the CCI in Q1 2025, the gap there is 40 cents.
At the end of the day, doesn't that equate to about 40%?
Does. So I think this is pretty, significant in terms of the conversation that we're having. How do we then account for that variability between what the GDP deflator is showing and what the CCI is showing? And I know we've got to pick a point, but that seems like a chasm if it's a 40% difference between the two.
And I think that's the core of the matter is you can see, and Pari spoke to the volatility of any of these construction cost indices. So if we inflate all the projects in the plan and we track it with one of these very volatile index, we very may well trigger the substantial change clause quite early in the plan. If we see that there's a 10% skyrocket and we go, oh, we got to adjust everything, and otherwise inflation is relatively flat, suddenly we look at the element and we might trigger something, we have to go back to the voter. I don't think that's the intent of where they're going. I think the statute uses GDP because it is a little bit more stable. This is pure speculation here, but I think the conversation has always been and always needs to be what happens when we have a delta between what we expected and what comes in. And so expectation, do you want to go full max? Like, do you want to just really run up these project costs and say, all right, everything's good? Or do we want to set a lower, I'm going to say unbiased just because it's tied to other metrics that we track, admittedly through different services. But it's the one that the statute points to for all of our evaluations. So what should be the ceiling for expectation, knowing that the additional cost is what we're recommending just be a part of a conversation to approve or direct to seek sources elsewhere of funding.
Paul?
I was going to say, doesn't that get us right back to the whole core of what is included in RTA Next? Using the GDP on things, as Catherine mentioned, on transit or other things that are kind of tied to more national pieces. But if we have 31 new projects, and we create some type of trending to understand what real costs are, do we have enough money at the end of the day to pay for those 31 projects? And I think that goes right to the core of the entire RTA Next.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just add a point. So we're planning to talk about this more next week as well. So this is a check-in point, and this is really helpful conversation. I think what might also be helpful is if we can provide to you next week a longer-term series of some of these construction cost indices as well, because I think what we're showing here is an anomaly. Now, hopefully, it is an anomaly and isn't a long-term trend because the plan wasn't built. The RTA Next plan wasn't built with an assumption that construction costs are going to increase faster than just general inflation, right? So, but I think my understanding is that the longer term construction cost change is more level and tracks more closely to just general inflation. That might just be helpful for you to be aware of. So I think, and Pari, please feel free to jump in.
Yes, I agree. One thing that I really have to stress with this graph is NHCCI is very volatile. It changes its relationship to GDP deflator quite drastically, and it could be triggered by any macroeconomic factor. So for example, if you look at the COVID recession shaded in gray, you will see that the NHCCI actually decreased in comparison to the GDP deflator. And that was because during that COVID era, there was a big pause in the construction activities, while the GDP deflator, which measured the inflation in the economy overall, continue to rise up. So my point is any macroeconomic factor outside of our control could very well trigger the NHCCI to come down or the GDP to go up. And over a very long period of time, there is a real possibility that they could even out.
And I appreciate that, Pari and Jamie. I mean, we can certainly continue this conversation and come back. I think you're hearing, right, some of the reservations from committee members. And I think, drilling down into this and, bringing back some additional data for us to, discuss. I understand the point Pari just made. If you look at it, though, following, quarter two of 2021 is when those trend lines crossed, and the CCI hasn't come down since. It's only gone up. And if you look at it from, quarter two roughly of 2022, right, between quarter two and quarter three of 2022, there's been separation of about 20% up to 40% over the time period from 2022 to 2025. So it just seems hard to fathom that index, right, is going to come down quickly in the next relative period of time. And I get it. We're talking about a 20-year plan. Maybe if we back out and see more of sort of the pre-pandemic data and how these indices tracked relative to one another in a future discussion, that would be helpful. But I think, we all want to be as sure as we can that we're not overestimating or underestimating potential impact as we move forward through the 20-year plan, given what we experienced during RTA. Let me go to Catherine and then Paul, and then we'll go ahead and maybe move on to the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, you captured mostly what I was going to say, which was if we could see maybe 20 years or 10 years where it really has shown that these two indices catch each other at some point and aren't just diverging as it looks like on this sheet, that might build some confidence. And then to the other point of volatility, of course, if we're looking at something quarter by quarter, there's going to always be a lot of change, but are there opportunities if we use something like the CCI to look at it annually with a couple of years average, try to do a little bit more of a best fit line as opposed to just these every quarter we're going to look at that snapshot. That might be an opportunity too.
Thanks, Catherine. Paul?
And then as far as, this divergence that we have here, from an economic standpoint for the economists in the room, do we have answers as to what happened? What caused the CCI to veer so high so fast?
There's a couple of things that are going on. One, probably the easiest concept to explain is the bullwhip effect on supply chain. So that whole gray area in the middle of the global pandemic, you have workers not going in, you have materials not being produced. Basically, production slowed, not to a halt, but drastically was impacted. And so when that happens, you don't see the effects of demand on that until things start to return to normal. And then suddenly, the impact of that shortage of materials and kind of the bidding wars that go into gathering what's left lags in continuous production, because now everybody's wanting to make up for lost time. It just really creates a very strong price soaring that takes quite some time to pull out. So this graph as we're looking at it is almost a textbook example of the bullwhip effect. There are other things that are happening in concert with that, but I'd say that's one that is really easy to understand. We had a period where less materials were available. Then when everybody wanted all the materials, supply and demand just drives the price up artificially over what it would normally be if production had been consistent.
Thank you.
Yes, that's one of the main reasons, but the effect is actually exacerbated by very, very significant increase in demand when the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, was signed into law at the end of 2021. So the federal government invested over $1.2 trillion into construction of transportation infrastructure, and which really hike up the demand, and couple that with the supply chain disruption from the COVID era, the price increase and the inflation within the industry really got exacerbated.
I think we can put this aside and, as discussed, come back to it with some additional information in hand at our next meeting.
Chair, just the last point I'll mention, and Issa, if we could go back to the FAQ sheet. The last thing I'll mention is that as an annual exercise, PAG is responsible for calculating those costs to the GDP, because we need to make the assessment of individual project costs going over what inflation would drive, because there's a reporting requirement. Ultimately, we also have to measure against, at an element level, if things get really bad, it might trigger the substantial change. So the thing I want to remind everybody is, one, we're going to have to benchmark to the GDP deflator regardless of any other decisions. And secondarily, if we inflate the whole plan and we trigger substantial change, that's really not a point of discernment, because that's still built off the GDP deflator. So, we were looking at a scenario where things got really, really bad. We're always banking on the fact that things normalize. Like, if things get worse, we're going to trigger substantial change. Like, that's out of our hands. Paul?
Yeah, I was going to say, we're talking about, one policy, which is how do we handle cost increases in the future, in fairness to all the different, jurisdictions. But I think there might be one other thing of a lesson learned that we have from RTA 1 is promises to the public. And maybe in the policy, we should consider some type of language that puts in, instead of having to upend this whole program right now, that maybe there's a language in there that says, based upon, the trends that we see, but we might have to shave off projects in the end if we don't have the funding for it based upon those inflationary factors. Again, so that as we move from RTA next to RTA sequential, the third iteration of it, that we're not in a bind with promises not met for the public, and we have some type of explanation.
Thanks, Paul.
Paul, Mr. Chair, I appreciate that point. I've got that noted. Absolutely, I think there's a place where we need to be transparent with our trends and say things are looking good or things are not looking so good. We have an annual report that does that. We have some statutory driven things where we need to track it project by project if things get really out of hand. But from a general perspective, I think we could provide some analysis and at least some forward-looking statements as it relates to overall plan health, kind of everything that we're evaluating today. And we will certainly be making regular updates to the board with that information. All right. If we scroll back up to close to the top of the frequently asked questions list, again, still in concept phase, because there's a lot that goes into it. Let's talk about PAR, that potential additional revenue. Just very generally, without reading straight off of this page, ultimately, our position is we can always take the difference between what we earned in any given year through tax collection and what was that original projection in the base year, and that'll give us a number. That number would not reflect any kind of cost assessment that would also be due to inflation. So in the simplest terms, we're recommending that in any given year, we do take that difference, we assess those costs, and then what's left over is the additional revenue that we have over that projection. Things that complicate this immediately and things that will be the nuance that we'll experience in real time is what are the costs in that given year that we are planning to expend? What are the costs that are coming up in the next couple of years that we are anticipating to spend? Once we adjust for inflation and we have taken that out, is our recommendation to just take that out right off the top. It leaves a healthy chunk of change, but it's not something that's going to be available immediately. I think everyone here understands that things can look good for a year and then look bad for 3 years, and we don't want to dig a hole and assign that cash right away. So in addition to the determination, which I certainly can leave plenty of room open for discussion, the part B to this is as we identify and let's say allocate those funds according to the 75-25 split until we get to the 55%, they're basically going into a virtual account. They are assigned to the jurisdictions. We understand whose money it is, but then we hold it. We're proposing a rolling 5-year. And so at the end of that 5 years, we look at everything, we true everything up to those costs as we have seen them and as they've come in. And then either using the real dollars from that first year or 20% of the balance, we just keep moving through time. And then every year after we've gotten to that 5-year mark, we're always just moving forward a year and paying out the first year and moving forward a year and paying out the first year. In talking to different folks at different times, certainly people are going to have different opinions on what that length of time is. If we want to shorten it, our recommendation there is let's still at least start with 5 years and look at where things are going. And if things do look great and we have this very strong projection of higher revenues than expected and inflation is kind of leveled out and project costs have cooled off a little bit, then yeah, maybe we could shorten that time frame. We go to rolling 4 or rolling 3 even. But until we really know how the plan's doing, we'd like to err on the side of caution. So that's our preliminary recommendation. I'll pause there again because really we have 2 things on the table. One is taking some kind of cost out of the pool right at the beginning to account for at least the minimum amount of inflation that we're going to see for costs. So that's, and again, that ties back to right now, our recommendation is GDP price deflator, because I think we need to set a conservative ceiling for that. And then secondarily is that rolling 5-year period or some version of that. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you for discussion moderation.
Does anybody have questions? I think inherent in all of it is, what happens if things shift significantly, right? One direction or another rapidly. And then how do we correct for that, right? I thought I heard in the second part of it is, right, the allocating of those dollars to the jurisdictions based on the percentage splits, the 75% city of Tucson, right, until the 55% overall is met. If, those amounts, right, above the adjusted or cost adjusted for inflation are allocated, and then we see a significant downward trend, and that puts the overall program in distress of not having revenues, then what happens in that scenario? Have you talked through that? I mean, I get it. We're trying to confine it, do it in bite-sized chunks, roll that forward as the program progresses. It seems to me, yeah, in concept, it seems fine. It's the detail and then what happens in the extreme cases that we should at least consider and try to mitigate for. Paul?
Carmine, directly to your point here, that ties back to something I said earlier with regard to, being able to report out, and maybe, we have to be honest with the plan as the plan goes forward with commitments to the public, but also might be on the handling of the contingency, because it could be up and down. You might be over the pessimistic in some years, and you might be under the pessimistic in others, and with a combined hit of construction prices going up. And it would be, how would you burn that contingency as well? I think needs to be part of the policy.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I agree. Thoughts from others? Andy, I'll go to Mike, and then Andy, I'd love to hear from you from the city's perspective. Mike.
Thanks, Carm. I appreciate it. So this is a tricky issue, right? However, I don't think it has to be. And what I suggested to the staff as we were talking about it is, this isn't like the money is going outside of the program as a whole. What we're really talking about is where it would be allocated. And quite frankly, I think there's probably a prioritization that's more important to the conversation than when it actually gets doled out or allocated. As you heard me mention to the board, I think that the debt service component is important, for all the reasons that we talked about. The highest risk is going to be in the roadway piece. And so if you think of it simplistically, we could put dollars there based on the risks that has, but it doesn't preclude us from potentially moving those dollars. And again, we're moving them within the potential revenue line items, if you will, down the road. I know that in my conversations with the city, and I'll let Andy pipe in as well, I know that I think Tim and maybe Sam had talked about shoring up the arterial reconstruction sooner, because that's going to be a big focus for them. That's all fine, but just keep in mind that, again, I'm not quite as worried about this, only because we're really looking at dollars that hopefully are in addition to what we've got, and they're staying within the program. And so the other train of thought is to maybe have a conversation around those dollars in that 5-year period that Adam outlined go into a pot that we just kind of leave there. And then as needed, we tap that pot over time. So for example, if we build that pot up to say 50 or $100 million, that decision could be made based on need at the time. So if the city is moving forward with their RTO reconstruction and they're going gangbusters, then they may want to be short up there, fine. If we hit some early snags on the roadway element with some of the more complex projects, maybe we allocate dollars there. Again, the distribution is defined in terms of, 75% goes to the city. But I think it's hard to try to identify those upfront. And instead, we should be almost looking at kind of looking back at what the revenues and costs have done over time. So I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts with you all, Carmine and team. It is a tricky issue, but I'm pretty confident we can come up with something that should resonate with folks. Thanks, Carmine.
Appreciate that insight, Mike. Andy?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Carmine, and for that explanation, Mike. I'll be honest, I'm twisting my brain, contorting over here, trying to figure out possible scenarios of how it can look, and don't think I have any significant gems, to share out of this other than questions. And I think you got at some of those, Mike, which is however we decide and with what frequency to look at potential PAR revenues, but what's the process for allocating those? And I had some outstanding questions on that too, like the 75% to the city of Tucson until the 55% overall is hit. Is that distribution up, how that bucket of PAR revenues that's allocated to the city of Tucson gets distributed across city of Tucson priorities up to us over time? Or are we trying to define that here? Like by element. So if we have more need in the roadway element, can we put it there? If we're short on categorical projects of some kind or another, should we put it there? Or transit costs, or we want to fill the pavement bucket? And I apologize if that's already been covered, but I'm a little vague on that still.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the next questions that I had for the group.
Okay.
A good time to mention.
Let's keep rolling, and maybe as we get through more of it and all of it, then it gels for us, at least conceptually, and then we can go back and revisit some of the details of it.
From a policy perspective, are the 75% of funds available to City of Tucson, are those influenced, informed, or recommended by the board? Are they in the purview of City of Tucson? And by virtue and by extension of that, the 25%, what are the subcommittee's thoughts on what that process might look for allocating those to the different elements over time?
Can the team clarify? So I know that there were dollar values, right, put into the plan for additional revenues, right? We needed to reflect them there so that if they were realized, we could utilize them. And I thought that they were allocated proportional, right, to an element's percentage of the overall plan. Is that correct? And how does that come into play in this discussion, right? Is that a firm commitment? I thought it was, right, that any revenues above would be distributed across the elements proportionally, such that, right, no one element got all of that and others were left without the benefit of those additional dollars. Mike?
Thanks, Carmine. No, that's not exactly correct. So what we talked about was that was one option, right? Is just kind of doling out the potential additional revenue proportionally. But what I suggest to the board is that we may not want to do that, given that, again, the conversation around the debt service, that should be something we have a conversation around, because everybody can benefit from that if we can move some projects up. So that was my pitch to that. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the element that has the highest risk, in my opinion, is roadway. You know, the unforeseen cost escalations in that. The other one that's not on the list there, but that we should be paying attention to is transit, because the labor costs could be a factor going forward. Depending on what labor in that realm is doing, that could be an unforeseen. But I was also sensitive to the fact that the city of Tucson had asked for, or at least had mentioned in some of their comments, the importance of pavement rehabilitation for them. And so they wanted to make sure that that was on the list. So I think it's really kind of up to us, or you, if you will, and the board, to make a recommendation to say, hey, if these dollars, or when these dollars come in, hopefully it's when these dollars come in, here's what we're suggesting that can look like. But I don't think there's any guidance that's been provided up to this point, because I suggested that this process would kind of uncover and unfold that. Okay.
Okay. And thanks for that clarification.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I grasped onto a prior discussion along the way, and appreciate you updating us on where things finally landed. From that perspective, is there input from the committee on preferred methods for prioritizing the PAR funds?
Mr. Chair, oh, go ahead, Paul. See your hand up first.
I was going to say, I'd like to, because the economists at PAG are closest to the fire here. I'd like to see something formulaic to go in based on their suggestion, and maybe that's something we can get our arms around, instead of having this kind of starting from scratch approach on this. Let the experts take a stab at putting together some type of methodology that we could, either agree or tweak after we have something to look at.
Thanks for that, Paul. Andy?
Thanks. I think I speak for most of us at the city of Tucson in preferring flexibility for the funds in our area, for the 75% that would come to the city of Tucson, to the extent possible. If that's acceptable to the board, of course, to be able to utilize those and work with our mayor and council to determine the best use of those within the framework, the RTA next plan framework at that time. So rather than a sort of formulaic distribution for that carve out by element now, since we don't know what the future looks like and what our needs will be at that time, to the extent we can build in flexibility, I think that would be beneficial to the city of Tucson.
Others have any thoughts on it? Marana, Sarita? I know we've taken an approach where we've put in place some parameters, but then also provided a process to allow for flexibility. What's the thought about, Andy's suggestion that it be left flexible versus putting a framework in place, but then also building into that framework the flexibility to allow for alteration, right? Saying, hey, generally, here's the prioritization of allocation of those. However, here's a process by which variations from that can occur. I mean, I get it, right? It would not benefit us overall or the individual jurisdictions to have to adhere rigidly to a predetermined prioritization when we don't know what the need is going to be over the life of a 20-year plan, and being locked into something and have dollars in a category that aren't beneficial, whereas another one is coming up short, doesn't seem productive, doesn't seem valuable. Paul?
I would say, I mean, I agree with Andy with regard to the 75% that's going straight to the city. Who are we to tell them how to spend that money? That's money that was promised to the city. So that should be at the discretion of their mayor and council. I would say on the 25% up into the point at which the city is satisfied with that 75-25% distribution, that we look at, I think an early suggestion was half goes towards paying debt service, half goes into a pot of contingency. That contingency is a rainy day fund. We don't know if there's going to be another pandemic. I mean, we don't know what's coming down the line later on. And maybe there's a way that if we've built up a lot of the taxpayers' money into that contingency pot, that we look at maybe adjusting the rate later on, like in the fourth quarter. If we can project that we've got enough money to do the whole program, plus, we're going to end up with extra money at the end, maybe there's a way to adjust that tax rate. Maybe it goes to a 0.4% or so, something like that. But for the time being, I'd like to put it in a non-specified contingency and split with paying debt service down. That's what my preferred scenario would be.
Thanks, Paul. We had a hand up from staff, and then Patrick, I'll come to you next.
I wanted to say, taking a note as far as a methodology for distribution, potentially, would it be helpful if we generated maybe just the pros and the cons of earlier versus later program allocation? Obviously, we wouldn't be trying to sock away stuff for debt service in the fourth period of this plan. And in the same breath, we wouldn't want to devote a very high amount of potential revenue in the first period to transit operations that might not be able to be sustained over time if we don't continue to have those revenues come in. Would something like that be helpful to bring back for next week?
I think in the context of what Paul suggested earlier, that, staff, based off of the conversation you're hearing today, come up with a framework, taking into account the input from this discussion, and then also adding to that, I think pros and cons would help to prompt further discussion and refinement. So I think that would be helpful, right? I think we heard, allowing greater flexibility, right, to the city in terms of, overall, I think is right, having flexibility to meet the needs as they exist at the time when the funds are available to be allocated. That's what I heard, right? But I think at the same time, we're always balancing against transparency and ensuring the voters that, we're doing what we said we would do with the sales tax should they vote to enact it. So I think, yes, coming back with some more outline of the details and approach would be helpful and result in maybe some further conversation. We go Patrick, and then I'll jump to Andy.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. And I do appreciate the recommendation from staff to get a better understanding of some of the trade-offs of these decisions. I'm kind of wrestling with this a little bit in fear of the unintended consequences or not well understood consequences of a decision that we commit to this morning, without maybe stepping through that a little bit more. In terms of that allocation and that flexibility comment, in those previous meetings, we talked about how to address the categoricals and maybe building that into the TIP process. So as we understand what that revenue is looking like, as we go into the TIP and we see that we have revenues in excess of what was anticipated, that we have some flexibility there, that becomes a programming exercise. And if it, is that the piece that's controlled by the city of Tucson, it's just in that call for projects that goes out that you have, $25 million additional funds anticipated over the next 5 years. This is your opportunity now to work with the TIP subcommittee to program that appropriately. within the categories in which it would be eligible. I think that gives us that flexibility to potentially avoid running afoul of that 10% for the substantial change, so we can balance that money a little bit and not over allocate in a given year as well. So kind of be monitoring that and think about where to put the funds.
Thanks, Patrick. I like that idea, right, of leveraging existing processes and committees to assist in real time as we're moving through the life cycle of the plan. Andy, I'm going to hold for a second. Staff's hand went up. I want to see if they've got a response to what was just discussed, and then I'll come back to you.
Sure. Actually, I wasn't responding to Patrick's comment. I was going to add to what Adam was saying, but yeah, just back to Patrick's comment in terms of using the TIP development process as kind of a holistic look at where the programming needs are, I think is something that's been talked about, and I think it's something we're going to continue to work through in terms of what that looks like. But again, our recommendation is to move back to an annual TIP process as we look to the start of the next TIP and continue forward in years past. Just going back to the comment about the distribution of the PAR, this morning we're going to talk more about I think we're going to go back to the construction cost indices discussion if there's any more, and also talk about cash flow. But those, I think, are going to be important indicators. We see those as decision support tools as we're looking back and we're seeing what those needs might be. So if we're seeing, for example, as we get through the cash flow exercise annually, that there's going to be a need potentially for bonding, that could inform what the priorities are for the distribution of the PAR, right? And same with the construction costs. If we're seeing that divergence continue, that difference between construction costs and inflation persist, that would also be another indicator. So we can start to put some framework around that as, again, decision support. But that's kind of the point of having those tools, is to help inform as guidance how we might want to release the PAR, but also leave that flexibility. So next week, we might even have more information to add to that discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and right, that dynamic assessment and then directing of dollars where the demonstrated need exists, I think is a common theme that we're closing in on. Let me go, Andy, and then staff. I don't want to cut us short in terms of getting through what you want to cover today on this topic. So please prompt us along if we're lingering too long on a certain item that we'll come back to. No worries in being nudged. Oh, I see Andy's hand went down. Mike?
Oh, I just put it down because you called on me and I didn't
Oh,
want
yeah, there you go, Andy, and then I'll go to Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This might be too much to ask. I know staff's doing a great job. I appreciate all these materials, but I think it might be helpful for next time's conversation to kind of show a graphical example of how this might look. So we've got our projected revenue line, we've got our GDP adjusted or actual realized revenue and GDP adjusted project costs, and then show kind of the difference, a shaded area, like this would be the PAR in this scenario for this year, or this several years, just to kind of help us wrap our heads around it. And then it might just help the conversation for me anyway. But I know there's a lot going on. So if you don't have time to do that, I understand. Maybe that could be done with historically. So with, you could show over the past 4 years, this is what it would have looked like, or we could use projected going forward. But just a kind of case study example to walk us through how that might look, I think would help the conversation if that's achievable.
Yeah, appreciate that, Andy. I think as well, a visual would help to go along with the conversation. Mike?
Thanks, Carmine. Hey, Andy, if we look back, there won't be any gray or green. It's all going to be red.
I know.
I just thought I'd throw that out. Listen, a couple of things that I want to comment on that I've kind of heard. So I'm a little nervous about calling this conversation contingency. So just be careful, and I'll caution the staff on that as well. That was very deliberate on my part when we went to the board and we talked at length about that. So I'm not opposed to the thought of kind of pooling the money, if you will, into a pot of potential additional revenue and having a conversation around that. I think that's great. I also agree with the conversations around flexibility. I think that is absolutely our target. It gives us that nimbleness that we're going to need as the program goes forward. So that's good. Back to your point, though, Carmine, I think we have to be paying attention to the transparency around that as well. However, I think that we could probably put language in the POP or in the codes that or the code that basically outlines the process under which those dollars would be used or allocated. And I think that you guys are probably onto something, thinking about what it looks like in terms of dollars come in, they're set aside so everybody knows they're there. And then annually or every couple of years, there's a conversation around how those are allocated. But the process is good, not only in the tip development, but also in conversations with the board and feedback just in general. So I think that there's an opportunity there. Last thing I'll suggest is Patrick had mentioned that that could be, we could have a conversation around the 10%, depending on how that all shakes out. So keep in mind that the program as a whole includes the potential additional revenue. So unless the revenues are woefully lower than what we were projecting, I don't see a scenario where we're going to be above the 10% rule and as far as the revenues go. I think the expenditures, that's a different conversation, and we can have that down the road. But just kind of keep that in mind, that because it's included in the plan, we've already got that buffer, if you will. So thank you, Carmen. I appreciate it. And by the way, good discussion. I'm really pleased. I think that we're going to end up with some really good stuff on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, back to staff.
So we've got definitely have some asks that will be ready and preparing for next week. The good news, Andy, you mentioned some graphical examples. We've got those pretty much ready to go. We're fine tuning them. I just didn't want to roll those out this week because, as you see, there's so many levers to pull before we have these preliminary discussions, and we kind of shore up some of the theoretical. Like I said, it's just monopoly money. We can always change something to make it look good, and I didn't want to do that before we got these concepts shored up. The last thing I wanted to mention, because I fear I'm about to go over time, is one thing that is also a factor in this conversation is cash flows and the order and the frequency and the intensity of when we're going to have these projects deploying and when we're going to expect some expenditures. So at some point, maybe more formally than just me saying it in this meeting, but we're going to look for some homework. We don't have a deadline yet, but there's the first tip planning activities that are going to be associated with this plan. But then there's the bigger picture, that 20-year horizon. And so, I'm sure everybody's been thinking about this already, but we will be asking for each jurisdiction to kind of provide their best estimates, a good faith, realistic effort of where these projects are going to land across the 20-year horizon. And maybe even to the point of where they kind of get broken out by phase. What that's going to do is that's going to give us some, there's the transparency and accountability piece, of course. We can't hold anybody to a schedule if we don't have a schedule delivered. But secondarily, it's going to help us do some long-range budgeting cash flow and some of these health indicators, some of these recommendations that we're going to make, this kind of constant gardening that we're committed to, can only be achieved if we understand what the outlook looks like across a longer horizon. So just put that in the hopper. It's going to be something that we'll be asking for more formally, but if people are already doing work on that, I'll defer to my engineering colleagues. That is not my lane, but it's something that we're going to need sooner rather than later.
Let me go to Paul and then Fausto.
I think that's a great point, because what we don't want to do is we want to bunch everything up and then we end up with a high demand and low supply, and then it inflates the prices. it'd be much better to even this thing out over that whole 20 years. So I do applaud having that conversation.
Thanks, Paul. Fausto?
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the conversation. I like the direction it's going and discussion of flexibility. One item, and I'm sure it's embedded in the hierarchy, but just be mindful of, we've talked about procuring or obtaining right-of-way, land acquisition, those things early. And I think that's something to be mindful of, is depending on where the funding is. I guess you would consider that moving some of those elements of the projects forward, but we've talked about that, potentially obtaining land up front, given the cost, and knowing that would be a savings.
Very good.
Get that in the considerations as far as where those revenues can be distributed. I think that's a really important point.
Thanks for that reminder, Fausto. Adam, if you want to continue.
For now, lots more to come next week, clearly, but I will pass back to Jamie for the next segment. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. Appreciate all of your work and for your leadership on this. And I see that we're approaching 10 o'clock, and this is sort of a break point, Mr. Chair. If it's okay with you, could we please maybe take a 5-minute break and resume? Maybe we make it 8 minutes and resume at 10. Would that work for you?
Yeah, straight up 10 o'clock sounds good. We'll be back at that time. Thank you. Team, I'm ready whenever you are.
Mr. Chair, we are all reassembled here in the room, and if we have quorum, we will resume. Does it look like we have quorum, Dan? Yeah.
We're good.
Great, thank you so much. So, yeah, I was thinking, folks, but I don't think I had a chance to thank all of the TMC subcommittee members for their thoughtful input and guidance for the first half of our meeting. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. That'll help us refine our efforts for the coming meeting. So Pari already had a chance to introduce what she's been working on in terms of looking at how we'll be monitoring construction cost indices as it relates to the GDP inflator or deflator. But there are a few points that I think she wanted to make sure she had an opportunity to discuss with the group. And also, if there are any questions that weren't asked, this would be an opportunity to do that. So we want to pivot over to Pari again for a discussion of those construction cost indices, and then we'll move to James to talk about cash flow. Pari?
Thank you, Jamie. So we talked about the NHCCI and the GDP deflator earlier. I do want to touch very lightly on those fainter lines in the back. So those are going to be the contextual index. So what I've picked here to show us is the employment cost index. That's the average hourly earnings for highway, street, and bridges construction worker, as well as the PPI. So that's the producer price index. And what I picked here is all commodities. So all the raw materials, earthwork, concrete, asphalt, all that good stuffs are in there. So these tools are contextual index, and they're going to help us pinpoint what's going on in the industry. So even though the construction cost is rising, if we look at ECI, the employment, we see that it stayed relatively flat. So we can say, okay, the construction cost going up is likely not due to employment cost index. So those are going to be some clue to why the construction cost is doing what it's doing in terms of trend. And we have the ability to track, especially raw material by element. So how's the price of the asphalt, of the concrete? So that would give us a more comprehensive picture of the industry to help clue us in on what's going on and what's likely going to happen. I picked here the national level data because that's the most readily available and more complete data set, but we do have the ability to track it at the state level. ADOT does have the CCI available, and the GDP deflator at the state level as well. So those are what we'll be tracking going forward, and we can come back with the recommendations of the specific indices that we want to keep an eye out for the health indication of the plan. Any questions there?
Any question from committee members? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Pari. And as always, if you have questions after this meeting, feel free to reach out to us and we will follow up. So pivoting now to the cash flow discussion, James will lead that. And we have an example on screen that he's going to talk through. And so, James, if you don't mind leading that discussion, please.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this morning, I'll provide an introduction to a very preliminary draft of what a 20-year cash flow might look like. This cash flow includes sources that have traditionally been within the RTA's purview, at least in recent years, like HERF 12.6, or referred to now as 12R, and STBG dollars. And we're also including an infusion of over $400 million of RTA 1 fund balance in period 1. And so the purposes really of developing this cash flow is to agree on maximum outflows each year without violating fiscal constraint, and to monitor when resources in a given fiscal year might not be sufficient to address project activities and expenditure rates which might require bonding at some point. So period 1 requires special attention due to the overlap of RTA 1 and RTA Next projects. So to maintain fiscal constraint and regional capacity, we've established annual regional expenditures for construction phase projects of $150 million. Forecast revenues and fund balance in that first period total nearly $1.1 billion. HERF and STBG over that period add another $237 million. And so resources within the first period are about $1.3 billion. So non-roadway elements will be budgeted for about $300 million within the 5-year period, and that leaves about $1 billion for roadway activity in those 5 years. So we've established a $150 million maximum for construction activity each year. So that leaves between 47 and 55 million annually, excuse me, for design and right-of-way activities. So if the region could indeed expand at the level shown here, RTA 1 projects could theoretically be completed within the first period. That said, assuming completing RTA 1 as quickly as possible is the priority, resources available to RTA Next projects outside of right-of-way activity and design activities and maybe categorical activities during this first period would be limited. If the region were performing at this impressive rate, there could be a need to discuss bonding at year 6 or early in the second period. When we study performance levels for RTA 1, our best performing year as it related to element 1 roadway activity is about $70 million. Most years were far below that. So the likely outcome is that this cash flow draft is unrealistically optimistic. It's likely that we will have significant carry forward amounts flowing late into the second period. Again, if RTA 1 projects are the priority, it will be very difficult to introduce RTA Next projects as they relate to the construction phase in period 1, or even period 2, if RTA 1 performance levels are an indication of a future product. So a future iteration of this would, might include actual project programming and timelines, which, those are still a work in progress. And we would even hopefully include them by phase. And beyond that, I think we could include possibly par values in the future. And, there's obviously room to tighten up these numbers, but I believe they provide a good general overview of what we're seeing, at least through the first period. So happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Good. Paul?
So big thematic thing I have to ask is period 2 through 4, it looks like HERF and STBG are grayed out. Is that, so we're anticipating that after 2031, that we're going to have PAG available. PAG's going to be funded again for competitive projects. Is that correct?
Is correct. Currently, it remains, it's at the discretion, obviously, of the regional council, I suppose. But if those, I'm showing out, them included, those fund sources included and also excluded. So you can see there's a line simply for the balance of TPT once the categoricals are satisfied. And then I provided a total if we were to include the HERF and the STBG.
I think that's I think that's a deep dark rabbit hole that we want to stay very clear of. I think I can speak at least for Oro Valley. We are incredibly positive towards this approach, but we share being a little anxious that the sweeping of PAG does not go beyond 2031. I think for fairness to the region, for dealing with unaccounted for, where we have a 20-year plan, God knows what's going to happen in 20 years. We need that flexibility, and that's what PAG funding provides. And I just want to put that plug in. Thank you.
If that's the decision of this subcommittee, I'd certainly be happy to remove it for the future.
Welcome any other feedback on that part of the discussion or any of the other points that were just covered in the presentation. John?
Thank you, Carmine. Just one immediate question. I thought the list of roadway projects that we've been working with has some periods assigned to them. But what I think I just heard is we'd be really outdoing ourselves if we encounter or we're able to address any of the RTA Next projects in the first two periods. Am I following what we've put together before correctly?
Just strictly from a financial perspective, it does appear difficult to include RTX projects in that first period. But you are correct that some of them are assigned to the first period for a construction start.
Mr. Chair, if I may add to that, we did make a revision near the end of the RTA Next plan to add some flexibility so that some of those projects, we had reached out to the jurisdictions, and you all came back and provided some flexibility for some of those to say periods 1 through 2, 2 through 3, and so on and so forth. So that has been incorporated into the approved RTA plan. So we'll just need to consider that when we begin the TIP programming process and adjust the cash flow per that. But it's an important point that we want to bring up.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, my only concern is how specific we get as we go out to inform the public about what's in RTA Next. We'll have to come up with, I think, a decent strategy to not immediately mislead the voters.
Understood. Yeah, I think there's the two elements. It's the financial, which, right, we're looking at here, and the cash flow that James presented on. But then we're dealing with the operational realities of being able to deliver projects. And so, Andy had his hand up. I'm going to go to him next. And I'd like to hear from, the other jurisdictions that have RTA projects that would be in that period 1 of RTA Next, right? So it's the city, it's Pima County, and it's Marana, relative to being able to deliver those projects with priority and also advance the other projects that are currently identified in period 1 of RTA Next. Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, starting with that last question of yours, I think our tentative construction schedule does have, for some of the carry forward projects, specifically 22nd Street, construction not starting until early 2030. So that likely wouldn't be in period 1, or I'm sorry, it would be towards the end of period 1. So yeah, breaking ground, but not really significantly underway before then. The others, I think we do anticipate being able to achieve in that time frame. On the comment about HERF and STBG, I sort of agree that I don't like the idea of them being tied to RTA Next from the outset. But if I'm recalling correctly, in the early days of RTA 1, when there were shortfalls in revenue collections and cost escalation was outpacing inflation, those sources were available to jurisdictions through the normal PAG programming process to put towards shortfalls on RTA 1 projects. So, I think that gives jurisdictions the flexibility to use them for the purpose of RTA Next projects, should they want, but not the obligation to do so should, any of the jurisdictions have projects outside of this plan that they'd like to utilize those funds for.
Thanks for that, Andy. Paul?
Directly to Andy's point right there, I agree. I think PAG shouldn't be ruled out. I'm just against a sweep. We've been living in a sweep for a very long time. And we ended up with excess cash because we weren't able to get the projects out. So it was an artificial sweep. And what I would like to do is make sure that as we move into the future that we never, ever, ever sweep PAG again. But PAG is a source of money that should be considered if needed. And I think this goes to the whole cash flow. And we already talked about policy on this. Not to have projects in the TIP holding up money that could be used for other projects if they don't have a ghost of a chance of getting out in like the next 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's consistent, Paul, and Andy, with what, the discussion has been over the recent period of time. I mean, I'm okay with, removing the HERF 12.6 and STBG from the cash flow in periods 2, 3, and 4, right, as it stands, right, with the understanding that if there were circumstances that required consideration of those funds to fill a gap, that it would go through the normal channels, right, for consideration and approval. Andy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think it hurts to show them here to know kind of what the magnitude of other regional funding is in those years, but not calculate them towards the totals, but show, grade out available projections for those years. Does that make sense?
I understand. I think, right, it's what does that lead the viewer to interpret from them being there? Maybe it's footnoted in some way, to indicate that it's illustrative to show those amounts and provide an overall picture of funding into the region, but that they're not programmed, right, in those periods as funds available, right? They're not programmed, right, or allocated to RTA Next projects. Maybe that's a better way to say it. Catherine?
Yeah, I agree. I think showing them on this sheet and then having them included in a line, all RTA sanctioned sources, is potentially misleading and guiding folks to thinking that there's an intention to use them on RTA Next, when I think there is not, there's a desire not to be needing them consistently period 2, 3, and 4. Back to your earlier question, I mean, in terms of our RTA 1 projects, I think First Avenue can be delivered in period 1. I think Silver Bell will be the tail end, because that hasn't even really begun in any measurable way. So I don't think that's going to have significant spending in period 1. There's going to be a really big tip amendment, I think, required should RTA Next pass in March. And I know we've brought it up in TPC, the potential of starting to get more into the details of what the next 5-year period looks like early, so that we're ready to implement an amendment should it be needed. And I think that's when we're really going to flush out the cash flow potential concerns in this first 5-year period. And then beyond that, it gets a bit more speculative.
Thanks for that, Catherine. Fausto?
Yeah, the same sentiment as the group. I don't think showing the 12.6 and the STBG in the later years, I think that's misleading. And I think you had mentioned footnote or something along those lines, or just saying, not anticipated to be used, or somehow, however that's articulated, but I don't think we show it, is my opinion. And in regards to the projects, yeah, the Tangerine Road, that we're obviously working on the 2A currently, and 2B's in design, will be at 100% relatively soon. That one will be ready to go early in the period. And not to speak for ADOT per se, but the Moore Road TI, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done for that one. So I don't see a lot of spending, maybe some work at the tail end of the first period, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done before that one's put in play, as it's a new TI on the highway system.
Appreciate that. Jason?
Yeah, I have a Camino de Oeste in period 1. Like I said before, it's pretty much shovel ready. You just need to update some of the environmental and cultural docs. And then also some minor changes to the plans that we already have. So I think we're good to go on. I can bring on an engineer or some to update those plans using some travel transportation funds. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So I think feedback for the team is, reformatting how the regional funds are shown in period 2, 3, and 4. The point that I think Catherine made, right now, the way it's shown on the table, it rolls up under that all RTA sanctioned sources roadway for those periods, those 2, 3, and 4 periods, and so could be misleading. How do we identify that we have these funds in the region, but that they are not currently allocated in those periods to RTA projects? And then I think also needing to overlay then the RTA Next project periods with the cash flow and the potential limitations in being able to deliver RTA projects as well as RTA Next projects in period 1 as identified and we've been discussing. Go to Andy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. One other thing that just dawned on me in terms of period 1 and cash flow is in the transit element. Looks like I'm not sure that the $70 million for the high capacity transit project in the city of Tucson, and maybe this is a question for you, James and team, how are those funds distributed in the transit line? I'll just note that per our where we're at right now with the FTA in our project development process with them for the potential federal grant, which is the matching portion of those funds, has the project in the later years of the first period. So that would be important to the city of Tucson because those matching funds would be necessary for that project in probably 29 and 30 mostly. And I can share a more detailed financial plan, almost specifically how much, but curious if how those were built in here, if you guys just did how you spread out the transit funds.
I've not included those. Like I said, these are very preliminary numbers, and so I can certainly address that before we meet again.
Okay. And then I'll share that financial plan with you so you have a sense of, and again, that is contingent on the federal grant being awarded, but should it be awarded on the schedule that we're proposing right now, those funds would be needed in the first period.
Thanks for pointing that out, Andy. Jason, did your hand go back up?
No, sorry, that's from prior.
It's all good. So I'm thinking that, some conversation between the RTA team and the jurisdictions on this topic of delivery, of RTA projects and RTA 1 or RTA Next projects in period 1, right? I know we've gone back and we've reaffirmed that several times, but I think that this is critical to what we're talking about here, and we've got to have a high confidence level that we can deliver what we're showing within the time period that it's committed. So some follow-up discussion by RTA staff with the jurisdictions that have both RTA projects and RTA Next projects in period 1.
I think we're going to touch on that a little bit as part of agenda item number 4, future agenda items and timeline. So we'd be happy to address that at that time.
Very good.
So if I may jump in, Mr. Chair?
Please, Jamie.
I just wanted to check if there are any questions for James before we wrap up this conversation and talk about next steps. So just kind of pausing to see if any hands go up in terms of the cash flow. And so, okay, I'm not seeing any. Again, if you have questions, feel free to follow up with us after the meeting. I was taking some notes during the last several discussions in terms of follow-up, and here's what I wrote. For the potential additional revenue calculations, there's a request to provide a graphical example for the next meeting. And also consider maybe some text on how the PAR will be considered for distribution. That could be potentially reviewed for inclusion in the POPs. Oh, maybe I'll pause, Mr. Kiesler.
If you could put a listing in each of the years of the element one projects, which ones are going to be happening at each year, that would help, I think, provide a little more clarity for us as well.
Yeah, so marry that with the cash flow, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so on the cash flow, show a delineation of which projects are identified as being constructed within each period.
I see. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I wasn't sure which that applied to. So that's for the cash flow discussion. And yeah, I think as Dan mentioned, we may kind of talk about that after I wrap this up, because we're starting to blend into sort of the delivery conversation. But yeah, I think that is our intent, Paul, to incorporate the detailed project schedules into the cash flow at some point. I don't know that we'll have that for next week though, but we'll talk more about that. Just going again through my list of things that staff will do. The construction cost indices that were shown, we'd like to provide a longer term series so that we can look at what does that index look like compared to, say, the GDP deflator over, say, 10 or 20 years. Adam had referred to this, maybe we'll talk about this before the end of this meeting, is that follow-up request for the detailed project schedule information. Actually, some of this was shared with us verbally, but we may want to actually make it more specific and time definite. And then the cash flow, we heard about reformatting so that the SDBG and the HERF, the regional funds, that those aren't in that line, implying that there would be a sweep even though they're grayed out. So we'd maybe add those as a footnote. Also incorporate the high capacity transit. So those are some of the things I wrote down as next steps for refinement, plus any others that staff see so that we can help walk through some of these next week. But want to see if there are any other suggestions, comments, just generally in terms of this conversation about financial performance measures and what we can bring back next week.
Jimmy, I think you captured the key ones that we've talked about. I'll ask anyone have any further items you'd like staff to identify and bring back.
Okay, well, thank you very much again for all of your input and allowing us to walk through what we have so far, and we'll bring back more next week. And I'll turn it over to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie and staff. That was a great financial overview. I appreciate all the effort on that, and great summary on the action items there, Jamie. Mr. Chair, if it's okay, we could move into item number 3, update on the POPs.
Yes, please.
All right. With that, we did receive a couple of follow-up comments. If you recall, before our break, we had a comment resolution, and the action from that was to come back and address comments, resend those out. So we did that. There were about 50 of the B comments that we had, which were staff would provide a recommendation for you all to review and concur with. By and large, the comments that we got back from the county and Marana agreed with the majority of the staff recommendations, but there are some that we need to review internally, which we're going to do tomorrow. And then we'll be prepared to follow up and finalize the resolution on those items in our next meeting on the 22nd. So that's our recommendation there. If there are any additional comments that are intending to come in, if you could please get those to us as soon as possible, just so that we can ensure that we address them and prepare for our meeting next Wednesday, that would be great. But otherwise, I think the comments received are very straightforward, and we could address those and be ready for next Wednesday.
Okay, that sounds good, Dan. Any questions from the committee? Okay. Does that conclude item number 3, Dan?
I believe it does. just, I guess, well, one more, follow up on that. So just to close the loop on the whole POPs update, once we have that matrix finalized, of course, we'll be going back and actually incorporating those comments and track changes in the actual POPs document. So our intent is for our last week and our last meeting, we'll have those available to you all so that you can see not just that we address them in the matrix, but we address them within the document itself. Our intent is to send those out to everyone in advance of our last meeting so that everyone can see that everything has indeed been addressed. So just wanted to circle back and close the loop there. That is our intent.
Okay, very good. All right.
And with that, that's it for item 3.
Yeah, item number 4.
All right. So future agenda items. So just looking at our timeline, next week we wanted to follow up on the action items that Jamie just broke down for today that you all recommended for us, so we could follow up with some of those updated financial tools. And we also want to get into a discussion on the delivery side. So part of this, of course, is financial, but the other part, as alluded to in conversation, is delivery. And part of that would be project tracking and tip tracking, of course. And so and in a moment, I'll turn it over to Jim to kind of discuss what we're thinking on that and how we could move forward. The other items for the next meeting on the 22nd, as mentioned, would be the comment resolution. And then we also have, as part of earlier recommendations by the Vice Chair, Mr. Kiesler, if you recall, we have a section in the admin code, oversight and transparency, that's section 8. That's right before the POPs, but it was recommended to update that and incorporate it into the POPs. So internally, we're almost done with our review and recommendations there. We have had some iterative process with regarding the CART role, which we wanted to ensure that we included there. So we have had some feedback from this group, from the CART, and from the board, as well as our executive director, and we want to incorporate all that and send that out as well. So that'll be the one homework assignment this coming week, is to review that section when it comes out to you, hopefully very soon. And then we could discuss that as well and incorporate it as part of our overall comment resolution. So those are kind of the intended items for next week at a high level. And then if there are any questions or concerns with that, I could address that. But if not, I could turn it over to Jim to talk about the project delivery side in more detail.
Any questions for the team? I'm not seeing any hands up, so we can go to Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee. We've got quite a number of projects that are going to be needing to start rolling out in the next 5-year period if this passes. In fact, I think we've got 10 projects in period 1 and 7 RTA next projects are from the 2006 plan. So, and that does not even include the projects that are not brought up in the RTA next ballot that are still moving forward. So a lot of work coming forward, a lot of projects that we don't have a whole lot of information yet on in terms of, what the jurisdictions have in mind in terms of project deliveries. And we will need to be tracking this and reporting to the public our progress. So what we're working on is a tool that will allow us to, on a project-by-project basis, look at performance with respect to schedule and performance with respect to budget. What I will be doing over the course of the next several days is reaching out to all of you and letting you or providing you a draft schedule and budget that I'd like you to change. Make it fit what you believe it to be. Tell us what you are thinking, and then we'll be able to use that to begin the development of this project tracking process. This will also be able to give us check on our cash flow as well. So between the schedule and the cash flow, that'll help us really track the projects going forward. We've developed a spreadsheet that I think is pretty straightforward and will give us that information, and we'll be sharing it with you next week.
Okay. Are there any questions from the committee members? I'm not seeing any. Dan, do you all have then what you need from us?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
One comment, Mr. Chair, on what Jim said. So I think this is going to be an iterative process. Of course, the information that you all provide is going to help us in developing that, draft tip. To Catherine's point earlier, and to Adam's point, is that we're going to have to start, working on what this looks like from an illustrative perspective to better understand that cash flow and regional delivery ability. So this will be an iterative process, but this is step one. So a very important component of that, and we do appreciate everyone working on that. And I think in our next meeting, we can come back and discuss that in a little bit more detail and talk about the timing of when we'll need that back. But we just wanted to address the concept in this meeting so that it's on your radar and you know what it is when Jim sends it out.
I appreciate that. Dan, can you touch on, we had set the end of this month, October 31st, as the time frame to wrap up our efforts as a subcommittee to have then materials available for the TMC. And it looks like that next TMC meeting is November 12th. Are we trending to conclude with what we need to get done, or are there adjustments that we need to make? Do we need to add another meeting in, or how do we look from getting you what's needed for the TMC meeting?
We're still very much on track with our schedule. So again, we've got next week, the 22nd, to go over the items that I reviewed. The 29th will be our final meeting. And after our next meeting, we could update that as far as what the specific agenda items will be for that final meeting. Potentially, there could be flexibility in November to meet again as needed. But if we have consensus on the updates to the POPs and admin code, then that part of our task at least would be complete. Pending any follow-up that we get from the TMC and board, if they're not satisfied with everything that we provide them, we may circle back and make some more updates, of course. But at this point, I think we're currently on schedule.
Understood, and thank you. Appreciate all the work of staff to provide materials for us to have these conversations and give you feedback and keep the process moving along. So if there's no other topics to cover, or hearing none, I will go ahead and move for adjournment then. Any objections to adjourning? All righty. So be it. Thanks all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All.
Bye.